A Bloodbath in the Border Princes. Part 2. Before the Storm continued. The line between genius and madness. Fenton Frosthold walked along the docks, lost in his own thoughts. It had been 3 weeks since his ship, the Red Squirrel, had limped into Barakvar. 3 weeks of effort, of blood, of toil, and most importantly, of mounting expenses. The Black Gulf had a fearsome reputation. Between the pirates and monsters, bad weather had seemed the least of their concerns. But Frosthold's ship had run into rough seas and taken a battering. The Red Squirrel was getting on in years. Its once powerful steam engine was becoming more temperamental with age, and segments of the armor replaced with cheaper iron fittings. Before the storm, the Red Squirrel was an old but serviceable monitor. Certainly, as compared to the sail-powered vessels of lesser races, it was a mighty weapon. Now, the Squirrel sat idle in the docks of Barakvar, its crew scrounging for the means to fix it. Time had not been kind to Frosthold's endeavors as a freebooter and dwarf mariner. First, a monster had swallowed a prize ship he had rightfully taken from those blasted elves. Then, the prize quantity of Bugman's brew had been set ablaze by a cannon malfunction. Their first in months. This storm had been the final straw. Even as he walked along the docks, Frosthold's anger began to boil. But, luckily for him, it had dissipated as he reached the tavern, the King's Flagon. Inside was a meeting with a dwarf who could turn his entire fortunes around. Frosthold had to steel himself. "Cousin!" shouted Frosthold as he walked to the table in the back. A young dwarf, with barely a full beard, shirked a little at the attention. It was still too early for most dwarves to be drinking, though all but the poorest would have chosen this tavern. The King's Flagon served primarily human sailors, and hence why it was the perfect meeting spot for Frosthold and his cousin. "Ah, Cousin Steelhammer, it does an old dwarf good to see his kin." Frosthold pulled up a chair, not quite sure why his cousin chose this far back into the tavern. Dogrin Steelhammer was in fact distantly related to Frosthold, a fact that the older dwarf never failed to mention when their clans had gatherings. Both of them were most certainly the black sheep of their families. "Yes, Fenton, it's good to see you too." Steelhammer looked upon Frosthold's more ragged clothes. I see the times have not been good to you." Frosthold grinned and dismissed the comment. "Just a spot of bad luck is all. Do you have the plans?" Steelhammer's face grew a little more pale as he reached into his satchel and revealed a parchment of some age. Frosthold grinned as it was laid out before him. "I am taking a great risk for you, cousin. The other engineers at the guild would have my beard if they knew I made this for you." He looked away as Frosthold pored over the plans. A lifetime at sea, a strange choice for a dwarf, had given him some knowledge of the finer points of engineering. But the thing described in the parchment was perhaps finer still. In fact, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Frosthold smiled at his cousin's work. If any dwarf could realize the plan, it would be the Steelhammer. After all, their sire, Mungrin Steelhammer, built the first dwarven Nautilus. 'Twas Dogrin's turn at the wheel, so to speak. "So can it be built?" inquired Frosthold, his mind now ablaze with the possibilities. Steelhammer adjusted his glasses and sighed. "In theory, yes. I have more calculations to make, but it could be built. There is a site within Barakvar, with the facilities even. But it will not come cheap, cousin. Are you sure you have the funds for an undertaking like this? I saw the squirrel in the dock. It doesn't look good." Frosthold slammed his hand into the table, drawing a concerned look from the dwarf who kept the bar. "Don't you worry about me, laddie. Benton Frosthold always pays his debts. Tell your engineers to start the work. Frosthold will pay his debts." In the back of his mind, Frosthold felt anger being replaced with dread. He would most certainly pay his debts. "Pull crank harder, slaves." Skickle Cindersnout, the chief engineer, was a hard master. In his right claw he held a strange staff that glowed with otherworldly energies, its head topped with a strange glowing gem. In his left claw he held a fiercely barbed whip, and it was with this that he motivated his Skaven slaves. Deep within the earth, in a secret cavern, far from the prying eyes of rivals, Skickle Cindersnout labored fiercely on devices and machines he hoped would bring him vengeance. Cindersnout was no chosen name of his, but the product of an experiment, or rather, a failed one. The lesser engineers, the thief traitors, as he would have called them, gave him that name after a machine had exploded near his face, burning part of his snout. Skickle maintained that he was sabotaged by his jealous rivals, but he had fled in shame. Working on the margins of Skaven society and selling his services to warlords and clan leaders without the means to afford the best Skyer engineers, Skickle had carved out a domain for himself in a forgotten pocket of the vast Under-Empire. His latest machine, a device whose entire workings were not yet known to him, was his current fixation. It was a great thing, a collection of cylinders, more like small towers, connected with all manner of gears and machinery. What it was intended to do, Skickle had not quite understood yet. The impetus to build this strange device had come to him repeatedly in dreams. Skickle thought he was being gifted visions by the Great Horned Rat himself, and so he labored intensely to build the machine in the precise shape as his dreams had dictated. Of course, once activated, Skickle had no idea what he would do. But that was a thought for the future. In the here and now, Skickle whipped his Skaven slaves as they strained themselves to pull a great crank that would turn a wheel and thus provide power to the machine. "Sent for rat ogres, I should have, yes," he muttered to himself as his slaves strained to keep turning the wheel. Like all Skaven technology, the machine was, whatever it was, a mess of looted components, more often Imperial, sometimes Dwarven, and a ramshackle collection of the Skaven's own manufacture. Deep within the back of his mind, something itched at Skickle. There was something definitely wrong about the machine, but his desire for glory and power overrode his instincts for self-preservation. Not completely, mind, however, as he made sure to keep some distance from it just in case. He was desperate for power, yes, but not entirely stupid. As the wheel began to turn and the machine came to life, the air in their chamber began to change. He could feel his fur begin to rise, as the air filled with a strange sensation. Something was happening. A light began to glow from the machine, which was strange because it had no lights of its own. It was a strange, unearthly green glow. Sure, some warpstone had been used in its construction, mostly for gluing the components together, but not to this degree. The slaves, finally able to build some momentum, their backs turned to the machine, kept on turning the wheel, entirely oblivious to the danger. That was until some great arc of green lightning jumped from the machine and struck one. This had sent the others into a flight, one that could not be arrested by Skickle's whip or threats. He rushed over, trying to stop the machine, while he assumed the lightning fried the hapless slave into crispy meat. Strangely, the machine somehow continued to power itself, despite the flight of the slaves from the room. "Kill, slay, you whelps, when this is finished," he shouted as they fled. They were trapped, of course. The laboratory only had a single exit, to which Skickle held the key. He was about to reach a shut-off lever that he had installed in a rare moment of foresight when he turned back to see a most curious thing. Instead of immolating the Skaven slave, the lightning seemed to be imbuing the slave with a strange energy. Rather than hurting them, the slave seemed to be transfixed by the lightning. Skickle thought for a moment. Was the machine meant to imbue the user with power, he thought? If so, jealousy immediately flared in his heart, as the slave was now clearly stealing the power meant for him. He was the chosen of the gods, and this would not stand. As soon as he reached for the shutdown lever, the entire machine in the lab were engulfed in a green smoke as the machine exploded. Skickle coughed as his senses returned. He was alive, more bruised than anything, and trapped under some rubble. The machine had exploded and damaged part of the supports that kept the roof intact. Skickle found himself trapped under some debris, and he could not move. He looked around for any remaining slaves that he could order to free him, but he found none. None except for the slave who had been struck by lightning. Miraculously, even though he was closest to the blast, the slave was unharmed. In his one hand, he held a jagged bit of glass. It gleamed with a green intensity that made Skickle worried. "Free release me, slave! Obey, serve!" The Skaven slave looked at him, and then down at the glass in his hand, and then smiled. There was work to be done in the service of the Great Horned Rat. The machine had showed him that. And Skickle's part in that great plan had now been served. The ritual. The forest was illuminated by many fires that night. Dark figures drifted between the trees and the haphazardly burning fires. These figures were shouting, brawling, and drinking. There was a strange atmosphere of celebration as misshapen figures cavorted in the light of the fire. Strange sounds could be heard too. Some of the voices almost sounded like men, while others were more animal-like. Someone was playing some kind of flute or pipe, as a thin tune carried upon the winds. These were definitely not orcs or goblins, but something far darker and more terrible. These were beastmen. They were celebrating a recent victory in the only way they knew how, by a raucous celebration and drinking copious amounts of stolen alcohol. Some of the brutes were larger than the others, with massive horns, and these stood near the center of the celebration and merely watched the festivities. A large figure walked amongst them, daubing their hides in patchwork armor and blood. This was the Bray Shaman, one part religious figure, one part sorcerer, and one part priest. He wore tattered remnants of a robe over his fur and carried a strangely twisted staff. He daubed the warriors before him with the blood of their defeated enemies. They all waited with expectation, hoping the ritual would bless them with greater favor from the dark gods. It was a strange ritual that they performed, but a necessary one. Beastman society, if such a word could be used for their anarchic ways, valued strength. The strongest warriors in a tribe would invariably seek to challenge the leader and assume leadership. To do so, however, was not easy, and favor from the dark gods of chaos always helped. The Bray Shaman seemed disaffected to the struggles of the warriors. The shaman stood apart from the more mundane affairs of Beastman society. They existed only to further the wills of the gods, not to dabble in the petty politics of lesser beasts. Still, it was part of their ways, and so the shaman did his grisly work. A series of anguished screams broke the reverie as the sound of an axe slamming into a head was heard around the clearing. The sacrifices were being performed. Contrary to what most people believe, beastmen are not a unified race. They are extremely fractious and prone to infighting amongst themselves, without the wills of strong warlords or higher powers to force them into a semblance of unity. This tribe, the Gore Reavers, had done battle with a rival tribe of the area and taken their Ungors as captive slaves. Beastmen were strictly hierarchical, in a fashion with the size of one's horns determining one's place in the hierarchy. Ungors, by virtue of their small or non-existent horns, were a natural underclass in beastman society. The captured Ungors were a curious sight, as they were hyena-like in shape and structure, as compared to the more goat-like beastmen that now sacrificed them. They howled, as one by one they were taken from a pen and butchered. Later, when they were all dead, this meat would be used for the feast. The last of the Ungors, however, was unafraid. Strangely, when one of its fellows was murdered, it would howl in laughter, as if it were amusing. As the rest of the captives were killed, the Ungor's laughter rose in intensity until even the Bray Shaman took notice. Something was amiss. He stopped his ritual and turned to watch as the laughing Ungor met its fate. When the axe finally fell, the beastman expected the laughter to die down. It did not. Strangely, the Ungor continued to laugh and howl even as its head was separated from its body. Even in their adult state, the beastmen knew something was wrong. They watched in horror and anticipation as laughter took on a noticeably deranged character, and slowly but surely, the blood of their victims began to pool into a mist. Amazingly, before their very eyes, the slain Ungors began to rise up again, their wounds healing. The leader, the laughing one, continued to howl as him and the rest of the Ungors began to attack their former captors with a relentless ferocity. Taken by surprise as they were, the Gore Reavers were in scant position to fight back, all except the Bestigors who, still bearing their arms, leapt forward to attack the newly raised Ungors. One would fall, still laughing, only to rise again and tear its killer apart. In an orgy of violence, the slain had slew their slayers, all except for the Bray Shaman. He stood impassive and still, staring as the Ungors surrounded him. Curiously, they dare not approach the older beastmen. They simply eyed each other for a while the shaman drew a figure into the ground with his staff. Something had taken a hold in his mind, and not even the entire warband's slaughter would distract him. As the blood sank into the soil, a strange cross-shaped ruin was etched into the ground, the blood pooling into its channels. This was destiny manifest. This was the voice of the gods clear in the shaman's mind. This was a sign. Blood for the blood god. All in a day's work. Magnus von Ravensburg felt immense relief as Ernesto, his manservant, finally removed the cuirass that he had worn for the better part of that day. The men in the camp often joke that Ernesto was Magnus's squire, much to the chagrin of the older man. Normally, a knight would be helped by a squire to don and remove his armor, but Magnus was no knight, and Ernesto was no squire. He was more of a manservant or butler, although Magnus still preferred the older man's help when donning armor. Ernesto carefully laid the breastplate on a nearby table in their tent, and prepared himself to undo the straps and laces that held up the rest of Magnus's plate harness. Magnus remained quiet, his thoughts dwelling on the day's events, while Ernesto muttered to himself in Tylian about the ingratitude of the cook. This was a ritual between the two of them, and they had grown accustomed to it over many years, and of course it was one that Magnus looked forward to after a hard day of fighting. In the background he could hear his soldiers, talked amongst themselves, and the smells of cooking wafted into the tent, reminding Magnus that he was overdue for food. "Ernesto, do you know what Maria is cooking for dinner?" Ernesto merely shrugged, and went back to unlacing the right upper pauldron from Magnus's red arming doublet. Like Ernesto, Maria had been in Magnus's employ for many years, although not everyone appreciated her cooking, the elderly manservant included. Tylians were, as Magnus came to know, quite particular about their food, and there were fierce rivalries between the cities when it came to who made the best pasta. Magnus bent his arm as Ernesto began to remove the pauldron when a boy rushed into the tent. Such was his speed that Magnus and Ernesto were both alarmed. Magnus immediately reached for his sword, only to curse when he realized that it lay on the table. From somewhere unknown, Ernesto drew a small knife. The two relaxed, however, once the boy stopped to pant and catch his breath, and they could see that he was wearing the black and red livery of the Compagnia del Corvo, the mercenary company to which they all belonged. Before Magnus could speak, and demand to know why he had barged into his tent, the boy withdrew a scroll and nervously offered it to Magnus. It's from Lord Lucenzo, sire. I rushed here as soon as I could." Recognition sparked in Ernesto's mind, as annoyance did in Magnus's. Lord Fulvio Lucenzo was the Compagnia del Corvo's most recent employer. The prince of one of Tylia's many city-states, Fulvio employed the company to deal with rising threats of orcs that had recently taken to pillaging the countryside of his city of Astiano. Over several months, the company had therefore engaged in regular patrols to the countryside to bait out the orcs. There had been several engagements, most of them one-sided, as Magnus made great use of the light horse under his command to bait the orcs into attacking more well-defended positions. He had in fact performed another such patrol today, and met a larger force of orcs on the field. The fighting had been fierce, but the combination of lead shot and sturdy pikes had been enough to slaughter the greenskins. While there would be a few holdouts, the back of the menace had been broken. A message directly from the Duke, especially at this hour, could only mean one thing. "Heinrich's purse, that damnable fool of a prince." The other two, not privy to the letter, waited for Magnus to explain. He turned to Ernesto. "Lord Lucenzo has thought to play the hero. He took a force from Astiano and engaged the force of orcs. Except Lucenzo is no military man, and the orcs cut down his forces and sent them into flight. The Lord has taken refuge in an old watchtower, and the orcs mean to batter their way into the door and butcher the survivors. One brave knight cut his way through to deliver a letter, but they don't have long." Ernesto understood the situation with a knowing nod. Lucenzo had played at the hero and lost, leaving his city undermanned for an attack by whatever remained of the orcs. This was a letter begging for aid, no doubt, while Lucenzo cowered in that tower, hoping the orcs would not batter down the door. Magnus almost asked Ernesto for the cuirass, but he stopped for a moment, his mercenary mind at work. Lucenzo had paid for most of the contract. He had proven to be a terrible employer, quick with his money, but bad with his sense. The company had almost faced disaster during their first outing, because the prince had waylaid some of their infantry with his own personal commands. No one would fault the company for failing to save the prince, and of course, sparing the lives of more of Magnus's men in the process. The thought lingered in his mind for a moment. Then he swore and asked Ernesto to fetch the cuirass again. With a heavy sigh but a slight smile, Ernesto did as he was bade. "Boy, you have done well. Ask Maria for something to eat. But before you do, Find Captain Koenigsmark and tell him to prepare his horses and one extra for me. When this was done, Magnus would be sure to tell his chancellors to find him some work outside of Telea.